My sister didn't introduce me to her fiancé's father like a sibling. She introduced me like a footnote. Something you include because the editor said you had to, not because it matters to the story. It was a black tie gala at the Hargrove Estate in Charleston, one of those venues where the driveway alone costs more than most people's mortgages. Stone columns, ivy climbing the walls like it had a lease agreement, the kind of chandeliers that make you feel like you wandered into someone else's century. My sister Vivienne had rented out the East Wing for what she called an intimate engagement celebration. 200 guests. Intimate. I'm Maya, 32 years old. I work in forensic data analysis, specifically financial crime detection. I build systems that find money that isn't supposed to exist. Shell accounts, ghost vendors, layered transfers, the kind of fraud that hides inside legitimate business, the way a parasite hides inside a healthy cell. I don't explain it at dinner parties. I've learned not to bother. People's eyes go distant around the third sentence, and I'd rather eat in peace. In my family, success looks like Vivienne. Vivienne, who graduated from Georgetown Law, who clerked for a federal judge at 26, who now works as a senior associate at a firm whose name gets dropped at charity events like a calling card. Vivienne, who is marrying the son of Walter Crane, founder of Crane Capital Group, a private equity firm managing assets across healthcare, real estate, and technology. My parents have been saying his name for 4 months the way people say a prayer. Slowly, reverently, like the syllables themselves have net worth. And me? I was invited the way you invite a distant obligation. My place card at dinner was wedged between a cousin I hadn't seen since childhood and an empty seat that stayed empty all night. I found it by accident. I wasn't on the seating chart my mother emailed the family. She said it was an oversight. She said it twice, which is how I know it wasn't. My mother met me at the door. She looked beautiful and tightly wound, the way she always does when she needs everything to perform correctly. She took both my hands, glanced at my dress, a deep navy wrap dress I'd bought specifically for this, and said, "You look fine. Not lovely, not beautiful, fine." Like I'd cleared a minimum threshold she'd set in her head, and nothing more. My father found me 10 minutes later near the bar. He put a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Don't bring up work tonight. It confuses people." I looked at him. I said, "I wasn't planning to." He nodded like I'd agreed to something larger. Vivienne found me near the garden terrace, radiant in ivory, her dark hair pinned with something that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She looked at me the way she has, since we were children, like I am a problem. She's mostly learned to manage. "Maya," she said, and there was warmth in it, but it was the kind of warmth that has terms and conditions. "I'm so glad you came." She squeezed my hand once. Then, "Do me a favor tonight. Don't go into detail about what you do. Just say analysis. People here won't get it, and it makes conversations awkward." I looked at her. "You mean it makes you awkward?" Her smile didn't move. "I mean it makes everyone awkward. Just be easy tonight. For me?" I turned back toward the terrace and watched the city lights beyond the garden. Fine, I thought. Easy. I had practice. I lasted about 90 minutes in my corner before Vivienne reappeared. Her fiancé, Elliot, was beside her, handsome in that effortless old money way, and beside him walked a man who needed no introduction, though Vivienne gave him one anyway. Walter Crane, silver at his temples, a dark suit that fit the way expensive things do when they're made for a specific body. He had the presence of someone who doesn't fill a room so much as reorganize it around himself. Vivienne's hand was on my elbow before I understood what was happening. "Walter," she said warmly, steering me forward like I was a prop she'd forgotten to set on stage, "this is my sister." A breath. Then, with a small laugh that carried the exact pitch of apology, "The quiet one. We always say she lives in her own world." My father, who had materialized nearby, added, "She does her little number thing. Data. Hard to explain." He smiled at Walter Crane like they were sharing something fond, like I was an endearing quirk rather than a person standing right there. My mother's contribution arrived immediately after. "We're just so proud of Vivienne, of course." Of course. As though that required no qualifier. As though I were simply not part of the sentence. Walter Crane looked at me. Not the polite skim of a man at a party calculating relevance. A real look, still and slow, the way people look when they're not seeing a stranger but trying to place a memory. I kept my expression neutral. I was practiced at this, at standing in the middle of my family's dismissal with my chin level and my hands quiet. Then something shifted in Walter Crane's face. Not gradually. It moved like a switch. His eyes sharpened. His posture changed almost imperceptibly, the way a man straightens when he walks into a room that suddenly matters. "What's your last name?" he said, quietly, directed only at me. "Osei," I said. He was still for a moment. Then, "Maya Osei?" It wasn't a question. The air around us changed. Vivienne's smile held its position like it was painted on. My mother looked between us with an expression that hadn't figured out yet whether this was good or bad. "I'm sorry," Walter said, and his voice had dropped into something careful, like he was handling something he didn't want to break. "Are you the analyst who filed the MV7 flag on the Meridian accounts?" The silence that followed felt physical, like something you could press a hand against. I said, "Yes." Walter Crane closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he looked at me the way you look at something you thought was lost. "I've been trying to find you for 14 months, he said. Vivienne made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Let me go back, because the story doesn't make sense without the part my family never knew. 3 years ago, I was a mid-level analyst at a compliance firm in Charlotte. Not prestigious, not the kind of place people name drop. We did third-party audits for companies too small to have in-house forensic teams and too nervous not to have someone check their books. The pay was adequate. The office had one working coffee machine and fluorescent lighting that hummed at a frequency designed, I was convinced, to slowly erode your will to continue. I was 29 and still learning how fraud actually hides. Not the obvious kind, the kind that hides inside the texture of normal business. Layered, patient, designed to look like operational friction rather than theft. A file crossed my desk that was technically outside my assigned scope. A mid-size healthcare administrator called Meridian Benefit Solutions. They'd been flagged for a routine review by one of our partner firms, and the file landed with me because my supervisor was out, and someone had to log the initial intake. I wasn't supposed to do more than timestamp it and queue it for reassignment, but the numbers bothered me. Not loudly. They bothered me the way a word bothers you when it's slightly mispronounced, not wrong enough to interrupt, but wrong enough that you can't stop hearing it. I started pulling threads the way I always do, when something itches. Claims routing through intermediary administrators that didn't appear in any state registry. Reimbursement cycles that were 12 days longer than industry standard for no documented reason, across thousands of accounts. Vendor payments to entities with incorporation dates that postdated their first invoices by 6 months. I built a model. I mapped the cash flow deviations. I isolated the pattern a slow drain. Almost invisible at the per-account level, catastrophic when aggregated. Someone had built a toll inside the administrative system and was charging a fraction of a percent on every processed claim. Across millions of claims, for years. I wrote it up as a formal anomaly report, attached my model, cited my methodology, and filed it under a case number that technically didn't exist yet in our system. I flagged it internally, and also, because I didn't trust internal flags to go anywhere at a firm that small, I submitted it through an external regulatory tip portal, the kind that accepts third-party submissions and routes them to appropriate oversight bodies. You submit into those portals the way you drop a letter in a box and walk away. You never know if anyone opens it. I moved to a new firm 4 months later. Better pay, better data infrastructure, a supervisor who didn't microwave fish in the shared kitchen. I didn't think about the Meridian file again except occasionally, in the way you think about something you tried to do right and will never know if it mattered. Apparently, it mattered. Walter Crane's assistant found me during the dinner course, while Vivienne was laughing at the head table and my parents were orbiting the Crane family like planets that had finally found their son. He was discreet about it, a quiet word, a gesture toward the small sitting room off the main hall. Walter was already there when I arrived. He'd left his own engagement party without anyone seeming to notice, which told me something about the kind of man he was. He didn't perform pleasantries. He sat down across from me and said, Meridian Benefit Solutions was skimming from healthcare claims across 4 states. The scheme had been running for 11 years. The regulatory tip you submitted in the spring of 2022 initiated a multi-agency investigation. 14 months ago, we recovered significant assets, and the principal architects of the scheme were indicted. One of our portfolio companies was a downstream victim. We recovered losses we had written off as unrecoverable. I sat with that for a moment. The tip was anonymous, I said. It was, he said, but the analytical methodology in the attached report was distinctive enough that our forensic team spent 8 months trying to identify the source. We wanted to... He paused, chose the word carefully. We wanted to acknowledge it properly. I filed it through a public portal, I said. From a job I left. Yes, he said. And the firm you were at had no record of the file because you'd flagged it before the case number was formally opened in their system. You were essentially a ghost author. I felt something move in my chest. Not pride, something older than pride. The particular ache of having done something real and watched it disappear into silence. I didn't know if anyone even read it, I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Walter looked at me steadily. People whose names you don't know kept their healthcare coverage because of what you found. Companies that would have continued losing money recovered it. The 2 men running the scheme are facing federal charges. He folded his hands on his knee. Someone read it. I sat there in a sitting room off a party I hadn't been properly invited to, in a dress my family thought was merely fine, and I tried to keep my face from doing something I would regret. Walter slid a thin folder across the coffee table. We've been building an internal forensic intelligence unit, he said. I've been looking for someone to lead it. The unit has investigative independence, its own reporting structure, and complete operational authority within its scope. It is not a conventional corporate role. He looked at me. I don't think you're a conventional hire. I looked at the folder. The offer inside was the kind of number that makes you feel for a moment like the coordinate system has shifted under you. I said, You don't know me. You know one file I wrote 3 years ago. I know the file, he said. The file told me what I needed to know. He leaned back slightly. But I'd prefer to know you too, if you'll let me. There's no pressure here. No expiration on the conversation. I nodded once. I said I'd read it. When I walked back into the party, Vivienne intercepted me near the terrace. Her face was a controlled surface with something moving underneath it. What was that? She said, keeping her voice low. A conversation, I said, with Walter Crane. She said it like I had wandered into a room I had no business entering. About what? Work, I said. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Maya, this is my engagement. Tonight is about Elliot and me. Whatever you discussed in there, he came to find me, I said, quietly, without heat. She stopped. He's been looking for me for over a year, I said. I didn't know. I didn't arrange anything. He recognized my name when you introduced me. I paused. When you introduced me as the quiet one, something moved across her face then. Something I hadn't seen in a long time, not anger, not dismissal, but the smaller, more uncomfortable thing underneath both of those. She looked away first. My brother-in-law found me after dessert. Elliot was kind in the easy way of men who've never had to be anything else, and I didn't hold that against him. He said quietly, Whatever my father said to you in there, he doesn't talk to many people that way. I've been watching him work for 15 years. That meant something. I know, I said. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. I know that too, I said. And I did. You can tell with people like Walter Crane that the words cost something, that they're spent carefully. The call from my mother came the next morning. She opened with warmth, which is her tell. Sweetheart, she said. We heard you had quite the conversation with Walter last night. It was a good conversation, I said. Well. She laughed lightly. He's an important man. Whatever he said, I hope you were careful. You know you sometimes come across, as she searched for the word, intense, in professional settings. I looked out my kitchen window at the street below. A woman was walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something in the grass with great philosophical seriousness. I envied the clarity of its priorities. Mom, I said, he's been trying to find me for 14 months. A pause. What do you mean? I told her about Meridian, about the file, about the investigation and the recovered assets and the indictments. I told her the way you tell a story you've carried alone for a long time without drama, just facts laid in order. When I finished, The silence on the line had a different texture than the silence she usually gave me. "You never told us," she said finally. "I never thought it landed anywhere," I said. And also I stopped. Started again. "You and Dad asked me not to bring up work at the party because it confuses people." Another silence. Longer. My father called an hour later. He skipped the warmth. "Why didn't you tell us what you were working on? What you'd done?" I thought about all the dinners I'd sat through where Vivienne's case wins were narrated in full, where my work was described as the data thing or the number stuff. I thought about place cards and seating charts, and she lives in her own world. "Because no one asked," I said, simply, honestly, without anger, because the anger had been there for years and I had long since stopped feeding it. "Not once, Dad. Not what I was working on, not how it was going, not what it meant. It was never interesting until someone else said it was." He didn't have an answer for that either. Vivienne called 3 days later. This one I hadn't expected. We didn't have the kind of relationship where she called without a reason, and the reason was usually something she needed from me. This time she just said, "Can I come over?" She sat in my kitchen and looked at the corkboard above my desk, the one covered in printed network maps and annotated flow diagrams for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. I thought she stopped, pressed her lips together. "I thought what you did was smaller than it is." "Than you are." She looked at the corkboard again. "I couldn't see it." "I made us both coffee." I said, "You never tried to." She didn't defend herself. That surprised me. Vivienne has been defending herself since we were children. It's practically a reflex. Instead, she looked at her hands and said, "That's true." We sat there for a while. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't repair. It was something more honest than either of those things, two people sitting in the truth of a dynamic that had calcified over decades, deciding whether they wanted to do anything about it. I didn't forgive her over coffee. That's not how forgiveness works, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But I sat with her. That was something. I took the meeting with Walter Crane's team 2 weeks later. Not because of the number in the folder, though the number was real and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't a consideration. I took it because the unit he described was the kind of work I had been building toward, without knowing I was building toward anything investigative independence, full scope authority, the ability to follow a pattern wherever it actually led instead of wherever it was convenient for it to go. I negotiated my terms: independent reporting structure, authority to bring in outside expertise without internal approval chains, a clear scope that protected the unit from being used for anything other than what it was designed for. Walter agreed to every point without negotiating back, which told me he had either expected this or respected it. I chose to believe it was both. I didn't take the title they offered, Deputy Director of Financial Intelligence. I kept my own firm. I structured it as a contracted engagement with defined deliverables and renewal terms. I stayed the person who comes in, finds the truth, and delivers it, rather than the person who gets absorbed into the institution and slowly becomes the thing she was hired to examine. Walter, when I told him, nodded once. "That's probably smarter," he said. "For both of us." My parents came around in the way parents come around when the world outside the family confirms something they should have seen themselves. My mother called to say she'd told her book club about the Meridian investigation. My father left a voicemail that was mostly throat-clearing, and then, quietly, "We should have paid more attention. I know that. I saved it. Not as leverage, just because it was real, and real things from him were rare enough to keep. Vivienne and I are not close in the way sisters on television are close, but we are something. We have lunch sometimes, and she asks questions now, actual questions about the work, about how I find patterns, about what fraud looks like from the inside. She doesn't always understand the answers, but she asks. That matters more than understanding. There was a moment, a few months after the gala, when I drove past the Hargrove estate on my way back from a client meeting. I don't know why I slowed down. The ivy was still climbing the walls. The driveway was empty and quiet. I thought about Vivienne's hand on my elbow, steering me forward. The quiet one. The data thing. The place card between an estranged cousin and an empty chair. I used to think the hardest part of being overlooked by the people who are supposed to know you best was the loneliness of it. And yes, it is lonely. But that night, Sitting in my car outside a venue where my family had introduced me as an afterthought, I realized the harder part is this. They weren't wrong that I was quiet. They just never understood that quiet is how precision sounds. It is not the absence of something. It is the opposite of noise. The patterns don't announce themselves. Neither do the people who can see them. If there's anything I've learned from years of finding what hides inside what looks normal, it's this. The truth doesn't need you to perform it. It doesn't need volume or a seat at the head table or a family that knows how to brag about you at parties. It just needs to be accurate. It needs to be documented. And eventually, not always, not on your timeline, not with the audience you might have chosen, it finds its way into the light. Quietly, precisely. The only way it ever does.